So this is our second Google Hangout of the Science Journalism class here at VCU. And I guess I should be speaking to the, yes. And today we are honored to have Michelle Nijhuis.
You got it. First try.
Thanks. Who has written for lots of publications, New York Times, Smithsonian, National Geographic, long list of forums where she has talked, or rather written about science journalism, also an expert in how to teach science journalism, and her advice, having written one book, I think, and edited another book.
Yeah, exactly.
Articles that in which you talk about that too, kind of your advice for fledgling science writers. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Michelle for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll pass around for questions. For anybody who happens to be watching this on the web, I will be looking at the comments on the YouTube page and also on our class website, so that if you have questions that you'd like us to pose to Michelle, just type them in there. Okay, great. So,
okay,
take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jeff. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, good. I can hear you now, too. Wonderful. So I'm talking to you from White Salmon, Washington, which is about an hour outside of Portland, Oregon, and the Columbia River Gorge. But I spent a lot of time in Virginia growing up in Farmville, Virginia, where my mom's family is from. And I understand the world is going to visit tonight for the vice presidential debate. So I've spent a lot of time in Richmond as well. So just to start things off with a few minutes of how I got into science writing. Like some of you, I expect I loved writing as a young person and a high school student, and I was especially drawn to journalism. I was really involved with my high school newspaper, and that seemed to imply that I should study English literature in college. But when I went to college, I went to a liberal arts school called Reed College in Portland, Oregon. I took a English lit class, and I thought, oh no, this isn't about how to write. This is about how to think and talk about literature, and I just want to read literature. I don't really want to think and talk about it, and I don't want to write about it. That's not what I want to write about. So I also happen to, because of very strict and I think well-intentioned or effective distributional requirements, I had to take a science class my first year in college, and I took a really good introductory biology class that I think woke me up to the reality that science is a process. And that's something that I had never, even though I'd taken a lot of science in high school, I'd never realized that. And I was intrigued. And it was also a bit of a personal challenge. I had been a bit science phobic in high school. So I thought, well, let me try this biology thing for a while. And I think I also had the vague idea of, well, I'll learn something that is interesting to me, and perhaps I can write about it someday, which makes my life plan sound a lot more planned out than it actually was. But I did have that idea in the back of my mind. So after I graduated, I supported myself with itinerant jobs as a wildlife field technician. I helped out on projects in the Southwest, on research projects on desert tortoises, on endangered frogs in the Sierra Nevada, on post-fire recovery in the Sonoran Desert. And that was all a great deal of fun. And I really enjoyed knocking around in the desert with my friends and my boots. But it also gave me a close-up look at the reality of a research career, and that reassured me or convinced me that a research career was not for me. I was really interested in the process of science. I was interested in how science was used and incorporated into our society. I was also really interested in scientists personally, like what motivated them, what led them into their careers and led them to pursue these questions for years on end without any typical kind of societal reward. So I liked all that, but I just felt I didn't have the intensity of focus to be a researcher myself. I didn't have the passion for a single set of questions that it seemed like a career in research required. I was the person who wanted to come in at the end and be like, well, gosh, what have you, what have you spent the last 20 years finding out? And how can I knit that together into a larger picture that ordinary people might understand? I mean, I was really intrigued by that process of translation, and that was a big aha moment for me. And I've written about the specific aha moment, which was watching my scientist friends chase this rattlesnake around in the middle of the night on an asphalt highway in the middle of Arizona, and they were so fascinated by the snake, and the snake was beautiful, but I was watching them and thinking, what the hell are they doing, and why are they doing? I was really interested in them, and I that was sort of the first time I discovered that my position in the scene, the right position for me in the scene, was as the reporter, as the observer, as the person who watched and tried to make sense of it for people who hadn't been there. So I got a internship at High Country News, which I read a couple of High Country News stories if you hadn't run into High Country News before. So, you've seen the magazine. We cover environmental issues around the West, the American West, with an emphasis on the rural West and public lands, since that's what really makes the West, the American West, distinctive, is the huge fraction of the American West that is owned by and managed by the public. So in 1998, just to give you a cultural marker, I guess, we had one networked computer in the office. It had dial-up. The New York Times, 3 days in paper version, 3 days after it was published. And we were a news organization. I mean, we came out every 2 weeks, but this was okay for a news organization. We were really up to date with that New York Times. Getting the New York Times 3 days later. So we spent a lot of time on the phone. We spent a lot of time in the field, in weird places in the rural West, and of course, technology changed in the 4 years I was there on staff. And by the time I left, we all had network computers. They all had broadband, I think. But it was a very transitional time in journalism and in the industry. It was really the last gasp of print, and for me as a person who was very early in her career, it was an interesting time because it was the last time I was, I think, the first generation of journalists who didn't have the idea that we could get a job at a newspaper and stay there for the rest of our careers. We were seeing our mentors, people who are older than us, much less experienced, we were seeing them lose their jobs, abruptly. And especially in the newspaper business, and to some extent in the magazine business. And again, High Country News is kind of a hybrid between the two. So it was pretty clear that as I thought about my career beyond High Country News, I wanted something that had a little more flexibility, where I could be, I could, in a sense, hedge my bets. I could kind of see where the industry was going and follow it. And my answer to that, and for personal reasons, I had met the guy who would become my husband, and I owned some land in Paonia, where the newspaper was based. I wanted to stay in Paonia if I could. So my answer to life post High Country News, and in the new journalism environment, was to become a freelancer. Everyone thought this was absolutely insane. To quit my very reliable job after 4 years on staff and become a full-time freelancer. But I thought, and especially to do that from a very small town. I was based in rural Colorado. It was 5 hours from Denver, 6 hours from Salt Lake City. So I was certainly not in the media hub of the United States or anywhere, or the state even. So it was a bit of a leap into the dark, but I decided I'd try it for a year and see how it went. And that was in 2002. And I've been a full-time freelance writer ever since, and what that means is that I work on contract with lots of different publications. So I will, occasionally I will contract with them for several stories in a row, but I am always working. I'm always doing, in a sense, piecework for people. That said, I have longstanding relationships with editors and publications that I've written for many years. But there's never a commitment on either side that I'm going to do another story for them, or that I'm going to do another year's worth of stories for them. It's always on a piecemeal basis. So that said, I want to say on behalf of all freelancers that I have made a good living ever since I started freelancing. I have, for most of the 14 years I've been a freelancer, I've been the sole or nearly sole breadwinner in my household. I'm also a parent. I had my daughter in 2008. She just had her 8th birthday. So it's been rewarding for me. Freelancing is not easy. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially the way I was trying to do it from a small town. It required a lot of, especially at first, a fair amount of travel to network and that sort of thing. That has gotten easier just as networking has gone more online in recent years. I've had to show my face less, which has been, convenient for me and my family. And as I've gotten more established, I've also, had to schmooze less, so to speak. Starting out, I wrote a lot for High Country News, my old employer, and I did a series about climate change that really was a turning point for me. It was a series of 6 long stories that was back in 2004, 2005, and that got me interested in climate change, which is a theme I've continued to follow in the decades since. It also gave me an entree into national publications. I won some awards for that series, and I also, it was also just a clip, as we call it. It was something I could add to my portfolio and say to national editors, hey, I can do a long story. I can do the field work. I can do the field reporting, and I can put together a long narrative that people are going to be interested in and people are going to read. And just on a, as a piece of journalism, it was rewarding because it was about the visual impacts of climate change in the West, a lot of which had not been previously acknowledged in a, to general readers. Like it wasn't always brand new research, but it was something that had not been put in context for readers before. The fact that we were seeing either the effects of climate change in the West, not just in faraway places like Antarctica and the Arctic, but that, or if we weren't seeing the direct effects of climate change, we were seeing patterns that were very much like the predicted effects of climate change. And at the time, again, this was a decade ago, that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. So that was a really satisfying project. Then as a freelancer, I started out at some other environmental, I started out freelancing for other environmental magazines like Grist, which many of you have probably run into. It's still around. Audubon magazine, other magazines published by environmental organizations. And then slowly I got into writing for more general audiences, which was my intent all along. I really, liked the challenge of trying to make these issues interesting for people outside the choir, though I certainly believe that preaching to the choir is also an important thing to be doing. The choir needs to be informed. So I wrote for Smithsonian, wrote for online only publications like Slate and Salon and so forth. And then the last few years I've been writing quite a bit for National Geographic, and I've done several features for the magazine, which has taken me all over the place and has been really satisfying to write for that large of a general audience, and to also have the resources of National Geographic, which should give you the time and the space to do a big story justice. And then in recent years, I've also been blogging a lot for The New Yorker, which is, I find, a very satisfying change of pace. I've always really loved doing long stories, and I've always kind of idealized them, as many journalists do. But given our media environment, getting to say a lot in a small space is sometimes I think it's sometimes almost as worthwhile as writing a giant 5,000 word piece that people are going to, you know, promise to read for months on end and never actually read. You know, giving them 800 words, 800, you know, carefully crafted words that say what you really think is important for people to know about a current piece of news is, you know, in terms of like service, if journalism is a public service, and I do think it is, in terms of public service, that is, you know, it rivals the public service that's done by a really deeply reported long piece. So I like that, even though I always thought I would be a long form, exclusively long form writer. I more and more like that mix of long and short pieces. So I usually have something going for Nat Geo, and perhaps, you know, another longer feature, and then I have blog posts, which are, you know, short stories. Basically, those are 800,000 word stories, for the New Yorker, or for my own blog, which is called The Last Word on Nothing, which is a group blog that I do with a bunch of other science writers. So that takes you up to the present of my story. I guess the things that are the common threads, for me in the last almost 20 years of being a science writer and being a journalist, are that I do love field reporting. I love talking to people. I love understanding new places by going there and having an excuse to talk to people who are, you know, off the tourist trail, not people that I would normally run into as just a visitor. I love that. It's not easy for me. I'm not a naturally gregarious person. So I find it challenging, but I also find it one of the most satisfying parts of my work. I, you know, continue to be really interested in science and conservation, and really dedicated to making sense of that for general audiences. I think a lot about my readers and who they are, and you know, I am also a curious but very busy and distracted person, and my readers are the same way. So I feel I feel like I have a lot in common with them. You know, I'm just a person who has a little bit of background in science, and has because of, you know, thanks to my job, I have had the time to look into this particular thing, and I can help to make sense of it for them. So it feels, there, in some sense, it's a collaborative effort. You know, we're all trying to make a sense of the world for each other. And then the other common thread in my career is that I have been willing to give up, you know, a lot of sort of standard conveniences for creative freedom. You know, I've lived in a small town. Now live in another small town. I love small towns, but one of the reasons I live in them is that they're inexpensive, and I have a low overhead, so I don't have to take on work that I don't want. And I've remained a freelancer, you know, despite opportunities to take on staff jobs, because I just have become a little bit addicted to that flexibility, the flexibility of schedule, and also the flexibility of subject matter and form. So that's the rundown on me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Cool.
Well, I have a question that goes to the point about freedom of subject matter and the life of a freelancer, and I'm just wondering how often, when you're an active freelancer as you are, does the idea for the story come from an assignment from an editor, or how often are you going to the editor and saying, hey, there's this great breast pump hackathon, MIT.
Oh yeah, right. I love that breast pump hackathon. It goes both ways. Excuse me. When I was starting out, I had the advantage of having a working relationship with High Country News, so I could just go to those guys because we knew each other, and we could discuss story ideas, you know, their ideas and my ideas. But when I was pitching things as a freelancer early on, it was always me pitching a story, and because, you know, people had no idea who I was, and so I'd write and introduce myself and say, here's an idea, or here's a couple ideas I have for stories, and they would say, you know, yes, go ahead, or no, we did that last week, why didn't you check? And or, you know, no, that's not for us. Like, it's a process of getting to know, oops, sorry, a little strange background noise, getting to know the publication, each publication, and what they're looking for and how they see themselves. Now that I've been doing it a while, and I know it, you know, science journalism is not an enormous world. Like, I tend to know the person I'm pitching, or else, we know someone in common. So it's a much more informal kind of communication. And editors I've worked with for a long time, like my editor at Nat Geo, I've worked with on and off for almost 10 years now. And, so we have an ongoing, conversation where he'll be talking about things that are being discussed in the office, and I'll have ideas from just my sort of general pipeline of ideas. So it goes both ways. But it's not unusual for someone who has experience for a magazine to contact them and say, we're looking for a story on, I did a story on the California drought for BuzzFeed last year, and that was a case where they were like, we want a long form story on drought, because it's something that's in the news and people want to know about. What are your ideas? And so then it's a process of, I know they're interested in a certain subject, and I help develop the story. We develop the story together.
Yeah, Kirby.
I was just wondering if there were any issues that you found that were specific to freelancing for science journalism, just specific to that.
Let me think. I mean, it's hard to say because I haven't freelanced in another beat, but I think, the advantage of freelancing is great flexibility, and the disadvantage is lack of collaborators, lack of resources, and lack of credibility, especially at first. When you call up a organization, a university or a researcher, whoever it might be, and say, I'm a freelance writer, they are like, I'm busy, I have to go to the bathroom, but so I think this is perhaps similar to other beats, but it takes longer to develop sources, because you just don't have that immediate credibility of being able to say, hey, this is Michelle from the New York Times. I say, this is Michelle, I'm a science journalist, I sometimes write for blah blah blah, and I just don't have quite the, I don't get to wear the magic hat like a staff writer does. So that's a big difference. But it's, again, with experience, that difference narrows quite a bit.
Other questions?
You spoke about journalism as a public service, and
Yeah.
with science increasingly becoming more siloed and more focused, how do you feel is your role as a journalist in the scientific community being able to pull out and make connections? I was hoping you could dig into that a bit more.
Sorry, you broke up a little bit. My role in making connections among within the scientific community, or making connections among fields for other scientists, or for the public at large.
So for drawing out kind of the significance of the work for those who might be not well informed, and also just kind of your role reporting on science in this larger area of science research. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. I mean, I see my role as a science journalist as someone who can understand something about all those increasingly specialized fields and put them in context for not only for the general reader, but actually for scientists themselves. I mean, I don't do much of this myself. I've done some of it, but some friends of mine make their living almost exclusively writing for the news sections of Science and Nature. So they're writing for an audience of scientists about things that are going on in science, because the scientific community is huge and diverse, and they don't understand each other sometimes. The ecologists need to understand what's going on in genetics and vice versa. So it's I think that is also a public service. It's just a different kind of public. And then I do think there's a real need for, even though journalism itself, the economic model of journalism is challenged, as we can talk about, but I think there's a real societal need for more science writers, because, as you say, the scientific fields are becoming more siloed, more splintered, more specialized, and we need more and more people who can move among those silos, and as the phrase goes, connect the dots for people, because science and not only is science becoming more specialized, but it's becoming more immediately relevant to our lives, and it's involving more and more larger and more complicated ethical decisions, and those are not decisions that get made within the scientific community. Those are decisions that we as a society make. So there's a real need to understand those things.
Thank you.
Yeah, one more thing about that. I mean, I think that scientists and to some extent science journalists have for a long time thought, well, if we just open the heads of the public and pour in a bunch of accurate facts, then things will change for the better, and that's sometimes called the information deficit model. And I think that we've learned through painful experience, especially with reporting on climate change, that reporting the facts, reporting what we see as reality does not always change the public's view of reality. And I think as science journalists, we have gotten better. We still have a long way to go, but gotten better at not assuming that the accurate facts are going to solve everything. We've gotten better at understanding our audiences, understanding where they're coming from, and how we might speak, not in any way abandon the facts. I mean, that's like the fundamental thing. But in addition to sharing the facts, understanding where our audiences are coming from and understanding how we can deliver those facts in a way that's going to be heard.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up and go just a little deeper into this idea of context. And by the way, I'm the librarian in the class. And
oh, wonderful. I love librarians.
Thank you. Everyone does.
I know. Really? Yeah.
I've been in this career about 35 years, and I'd say about 90% of the questions that I receive are from people who want to know what we know. And about 10% lead us to telling the student or the researcher what we don't know. I have to say the best I read today was yours that said coral sex is poorly understood. And I thought, wow, that must have been fun. Did you write that with a straight face? But it really made me think about this passion of mine for unearthing what we don't know. And I wonder if you would talk about that a little bit as part of the science journalist's role to report on that part of the context. What is it that we do not know?
Yeah, I love that question. And that's so interesting that 90% of the questions you get are about what we already know.
Or what we should already know and are disappointed when they find out that we don't know about that.
Oh, okay. And then 10% of the questions are what are the unknowns in such and such a field?
It's usually my telling a student we don't know about that and having to prove it to them, usually through a review. Another kind of an article often doesn't give that much context or that kind of context and background.
Mm-hmm.
A review article will convince them because it says we don't know much about. For example, I was surprised to learn a few years ago, and I shouldn't have been, but we can't make dirt. Topsoil is this. And here's this simple substance that's everywhere, and we don't have enough of it or won't have enough of it in years. But what a concept. We don't know how to make it. It seems pretty essential, but there it is.
That's great. I've never thought about it in quite those terms before. That's so interesting. Yeah, let me think of how I have several different thoughts about that. Where to start? I think, again, going back to the end of my last answer, I think as science journalists, we have struggled mightily, especially in covering climate change, to establish what scientists do know with a reasonable amount of certainty, because the way scientists talk about uncertainty and the way the public understands uncertainty are very different. The scientists, as many of you know, scientists routinely measure their uncertainty because they know that everything is uncertain. So they will point out, this is an uncertain. Here's the extent to which this result is uncertain, and the public hears that as like, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about when someone says they're uncertain. So there's a big disconnect there that has been exploited, as has been well documented, has been exploited by all kinds of people with with a vested interest in climate change not being accepted by society as reality. That gap in understanding has been exploited, so that the public for a long time thought that climate change was much less certain than the reality of human-caused climate change was much less certain than it actually was. So I think as science journalists, we have been occupied for a long time trying to establish the 90% the question, we have been trying to answer the kinds of questions that you get 90% of the time. What do we know about this? What do we know about climate change? And I think it is exciting and really fun to write about things that we don't yet know. And especially for climate journalists, it's kind of a luxury because we have worked because of this dynamic that I just talked about. We have worked very hard to talk about what's already known and to make that clear to general readers. So yeah, when I get to say, here, look, I'm reporting on coral sex that we really, despite trying to find out for many years, we don't know quite how coral reproduces, or there's a lot of things that remain unknown about this. I think that those are exciting stories, and they can really emphasize to people what I was talking about, that I took a long time to understand as a student of science. The science is a process, and it's an ongoing process, and that there will always be things that we don't know, fortunately. Does that answer your question?
It does. I have more thoughts on it, but there are a lot of students in the room that I
Yeah.
questions.
Okay, we can get back to it if there's time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Joe, you go.
So coming from a scientific background, having a degree in biology or that background, do you ever get like cynical or frustrated that you may have to write about something or sort of explain something that like climate change, for example, where you've known it as truth and fact for so long, and there's still people out there who may be like, nah, that's a bunch of bunk, Do you ever get frustrated or cynical with having to explain things that you've taken as true for a long time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, especially in the case of climate change, because I do, it seems like every year we understand with more and more certainty that there was and perhaps still is a deliberate campaign of misinformation, that it's not just people. I have every sympathy in the world for people not getting stuff, because God knows I have to look up things all the time. I have journalist amnesia, so I understand everything about one thing for a short period of time and then I forget it. So I don't get annoyed with having to explain basic information to people. That to me is part of the job, and I actually enjoy it. It's like, okay, it's like teaching. Okay, let's try this again. Let me use a different metaphor, or maybe here, read this different story about it. Maybe you'll get it. There's that kind of like iteration of where you're trying to build a connection between two minds, and it's kind of exciting because eventually it's going to work out. That said, the climate change thing, and where I know people have been manipulated by misinformation, it does get frustrating for sure. Because you know what you're up against, and I know that my personal worth is far less than Exxon's. Exxon has a lot more power than I do to win hearts and minds, but I think it's changing. I mean, people, unfortunately, we have journalism and science have been aided by reality, and a lot more people are realizing that climate change, they're either, as I was talking about in the American West, they're either experiencing climate change themselves, or they are experiencing something that's very much like the predicted effects of climate change. So we no longer have to work so hard to prove our case, tragically no longer have to work so hard to prove our case.
Thanks.
I was wondering how you kind of approach writing articles differently when you, based on the publication. So if you're writing for the New York Times rather than High Country, do you feel a little more comfortable, I guess, aiming to be clear rather than being creative? What's the kind of difference there?
Yeah, I mean, every magazine and newspaper is, and magazines more so than newspapers, but I think every publication is this way, where every writer has an individual voice, and the job of the publication is to bring those voices together in every month or every week or every couple of weeks, bring those voices together in a conversation, a coherent conversation, so that there's, you recognize these stories as both, both a story that I wrote and a story that belongs in Smithsonian Magazine. So there's a dual the job of an editor for a magazine is to make that happen, to make sure that there's a balance of what I might call the institutional voice and the personal voice, because it's nice when stories are distinctive and you can be like, that seems like something that Malcolm Gladwell wrote, or that's a story that any number of wonderful science writers from the New York Times wrote, because they have their distinctive voices, even though in newspapers that those distinctions tend to be a little more subtle. So yeah, I think I do certainly, when I'm writing for a new magazine or new publication, I will read the publication pretty closely and try and understand their DNA. Where are they coming from? Who's their audience? A tip I heard a long time ago and still works online, is to look at the ads that the publication has, and that tells you a lot about their readership, because the marketing department studies the readership a lot more closely than the editorial department does. They know who they're and they because they're promising people that they're selling ads to, who those ads are going to reach. So you can tell a lot about who you're talking to through the ads. And so I do tweak my style. That said, over time, I think more and more, as time goes by in a writing career, you develop a distinctive voice of your own. You kind of, for better or worse, you get more confident, so you can express more of yourself, but you also get stuck in your ways. So, a Michelle Nijhuis story tends to be the same, or to have some similar characteristics. So hopefully there's something in common between the stories that I write for High Country News and that I might write for the New Yorker, but just that there's an awareness of that those are different audiences. I might have to explain things about public lands in the West to a New Yorker audience that I wouldn't have to explain to a High Country News audience. There are going to be different things that are going to be interesting. High Country News readers really want to get down in the nitty gritty and know about what happened at the public meeting, while New Yorker readers are going to be like, now just tell me the upshot, okay, and tell me how that makes sense in my world and where I'm living in the urban East Coast. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah.
Have you ever felt an obligation to kind of pick and choose facts from a scientific article to maybe protect the public's perception of what you're writing about?
Oh, like to portray something as more certain than it actually is because I want them to believe in climate change, for instance?
No, more like just maybe not inciting panic or.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm fine with people being panicked. No, I mean, I see what you're saying, and I think that, it is something to consider, because joking aside, you don't want to incite meaningless panic, right? You want people to you want to get their attention, and then you want them to do useful things. That's not a journalistic bias. That's just, as a citizen of society, you hope that people are going to take the information you put out there and do something useful. I mean, maybe a good example of that is the earthquake story that was in the New Yorker a couple of years ago that some of you might have seen about the Cascadia earthquake. The story won the Pulitzer Prize this year. And that story, because of the masterful way it was written, scared a lot of people. And I interviewed the writer a couple of months after it came out, and she said, I was really worried in the week after it came out. I was, sort of pleasantly surprised by all this attention it was getting, but I thought, I didn't want to write a disaster porn story. Like, I hope this isn't just going to be a story where people are scared and then they move on to the next thing to be scared about. She said, and I was very encouraged, after that initial kind of panic, that people in the north, and I'm sorry, I should back up and explain, this was about an earthquake that has long, in the Pacific Northwest, it's long been known that this earthquake there's a chance of it happening at some point in the next 50 years. There's a 1 out of 3 chance that this catastrophic earthquake is going to hit the Pacific Northwest. And that's been known in the region for a long time, but the New Yorker story dramatized it for a national audience, and I think really brought it home to people in the Northwest, because it instead of saying this could happen, it said this will happen, and it forecast what it was going to look like when this big one did happen. And I think that was warranted, because the earthquake may or may not happen in the next 50 years, but it is going to happen at some point just because of the way the tectonic plates are set up. And so in the week, so there was a great deal of sort of freaking out on the internet about the story, and then after that initial hubbub, a lot of changes started to happen. A lot of things that a lot of kind of boring things that people have thought for a long time in the Pacific Northwest. We need to do this. We need to get our earthquake codes in order. We need to pass regulations requiring escape routes and so forth. People need to get their houses reinforced and retrofitted for earthquake protection. A lot of those things have happened, and I think that was an example of a useful scaring of people. So,
I have something sort of pertinent to that because I have a family that lives on Lopez Island in the Bay of
Oh yeah.
So it's just funny because I got to see exactly that article and exactly in those ways happen on a real person scale because that came out. Now both my aunt and my grandma who live out on that island now have like earthquake emergency, like a whole kit set up in their car at all times in case it happens, and like they
good.
have whole family meetings about like where to go when this happens and if they get separated. So it's just interesting to see that on a very close personal scale.
Yeah,
that was interesting.
Yeah. Oh, I've been. Lopez Island is where they don't have. It's ferry service only, right?
Yeah, you gotta take the ferry from Anacortes.
Yeah, it's out there. They really do need to be prepared. That's great. I'm glad to hear that because I think that's my impression too from living in the Northwest. It's made it. People knew about it, but it's made it much more a part of the. People now talk about it, and they don't just sort of refer to it and say, "Oh God, the big one's coming at some point." They have taken much more concrete steps to be prepared for it.
Sure.
Have you ever written a story that you kind of pointed towards not just the mass public, but maybe towards people in the government to change legislation? Like it wasn't specifically meant for just a mass audience, but to maybe push them to do something about climate change.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if I've done that intentionally. I mean, there's a joke at High Country News that we have most of our subscribers are in the West, except for this one in Washington D.C. And we feel like good. At least people on the Hill are reading High Country News as background to perhaps policy proposals and new legislation. But certainly, in any story. I mean, I'm always happy to inform the general public because I do think it's good to be, just generally a good thing to be informed about the world. But the levers of change are different for every story. In some stories, you do want to convince as broad, you do want to make a like the earthquake story, like that's a case where the levers of change are both in the local and state government and they're individual. So you want lots of individuals to know about it because just as a citizen of the society, again, it would be a good idea for them to retrofit their houses and make them earthquake proof. But there's other cases where, like I wrote a story about the Mekong dams, the Mekong hydropower, a couple of years ago for National Geographic, and this is ongoing. This is a series of 11 hydropower dams that are going in on the lower Mekong River, and primarily for power production. Some of it domestic, but most of it to be shipped outside the region for economic gain. And it's a real threat to the region's food supply. I mean, it's a food story because it's the largest. The Mekong is the world's largest freshwater fishery, and rural people and urban people in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and Thailand, to some extent, still depend on fish from that river. And these dams could could especially there's a couple of them that could severely disrupt fish migration and basically take away that free source of protein for millions of people. So the individual person in the U.S., it's so far away. Hopefully people in Southeast Asia are reading editions of National Geographic, but it's a U.S.-based publication. I was glad for people to know about it. I was glad for them to be introduced to the value of the Mekong if they didn't already know about it. But the people in the U.S. who can help change that situation work for the State Department. So I told the photographer that I worked with after the story came out, we have a local monastery here in White Salmon, and the monks come by for alms every Sunday. And one of them said, "Hey, I heard you wrote a story about the Mekong," and I said, "Oh, do you want a copy?" And I put, along with what we gave them for food, I put the copy of the magazine in their bowl. And then I got an email from someone in the State Department who said, "Thanks for writing that story. I'm passing it around the office." And I wrote to the photographer and I said, "I think we got it covered." The monks know about it and the State Department knows about it. So that's a job well done.
I've got a question about the experience that you and your family had living off the grid.
Oh, yeah.
About this, kind of the Thoreau chapter of your life. Did that inform your science writing? Did that help? Did that have any impact on the way you frame questions, or you think about what is a story, or just the way you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, in a million ways I'm probably not aware of. I think living in a small town, and in particular a town that's near the headwaters of a river, that's near a lot of coal mines, that's an agricultural town, I think that informed my science writing and my environmental conservation writing, because I was living in a place where things come from. And I was very aware of, the process of producing the resources that we use every day, and, the costs and benefits of that. It's like we know people who were killed in the coal mines. There's that was very real to me. It wasn't just something that happened far away. And then I think living off the grid was a benefit in the same way, because living off the grid, I feel like I'm always at pains to tell people it was really comfortable. It wasn't like we were suffering. We lived for about 15 years in a straw bale house that my husband built, that was completely off the grid. And there were certain things we couldn't have, like a toaster and a dryer. We couldn't have anything with a heating element that we used for long periods of time, just because of the power that consumed. But it was a very comfortable existence. But it does make you aware of the amount of power you're using, because you can see it in the meter. You can see, okay, the sun is shining and it's, the batteries are getting recharged, and it's been really cloudy for a few days. We better be a little more careful about what we're using. So I think just in terms of, inputs and outputs, it was useful that way. Always reminding me.
One thing that I noticed and really loved in the pieces across different publications that you've written is that there is a quality that I would describe as literary. There's a narrative art, beautiful descriptions. I was thinking about the coral sex piece, and there's a moment where you say the water bubbles up like boiling oatmeal. I just think it's beautiful turns of phrase, and I'm wondering if that quality is something that you feel has developed in your writing over time, or is that has that been a home? I guess I'm wondering, did you go from sort of hard news style of reportage to that more literary voice, or has that been a signature all the way through?
Well, thanks. First of all, that's really nice to hear. And I, daily news writers think of writers like me as, in an affectionate way, but in a hopefully affectionate way. They are like, these like slackers who are sitting around, thinking of the exact bon mot, and while we are out, actually telling, like, every day, reporting the news, and you'll read a story in the newspaper, and it's full of really important information, but also full of what we call journalese, which are these like stock phrases that journalists will default to because they're trying to do something so quickly. And I have, especially during this election year, I have every sense of gratitude in the world for those writers, because I don't care how much journalese they're writing. I'm just glad the facts are getting out there. But my niche in the business has been to take a little more time with how I'm telling the story, with the hopes of, it's just another tool to catch people's attention in this very busy world, where they're not caught by the urgency of the story. No one starts their morning thinking, well, gosh, what I really need to know about this morning is coral sex. Like, they're like, what's the latest with the Trump campaign? And they're looking at the Washington Post to find out what the latest is. But so because my stories don't have that urgency, I hope that by fooling around with words and telling things in a surprising way, that I can penetrate the noise that surrounds all of us. But it's something, I started out at High Country News, which again is like a magazine newspaper hybrid. So even though we did have a sense of urgency and duty to report what was going on, we always had a little more time than a reporter at the Times or the Washington Post might have. I wasn't expected to do 3 stories a day. I was expected to do a story every 3 days. So I always had a little bit of time to at least think about how I was saying stuff.
Michelle, in terms of advice for writers, extending, just kind of building on what you just said, besides setting aside adequate time, are there other specific tips that you might offer this group? And I realize that there's no formula to writing a great story, and that there are lots of different kinds of stories, from long form to kind of a brief. But are there any, sort of 3 or 4 things to keep in mind, I guess, that young writers should pay attention to as they try to practice the craft, learn the craft?
Yeah. Well, one very practical tip I have is to find a way to block off the internet when you're writing. I use an app called Freedom, and I don't plug products very often, but I will plug Freedom, which is, I just think it's worth every penny I've spent on it. And so I have, recurring blocks I don't have to press the button myself. I have a schedule of recurring blocks where I can block off certain sites, or I can block off the entire internet. In my case, when I'm writing, I still do need access to some parts of the web. I just need to block myself off Facebook or what. I need to block out certain distractions. So I do that, and that, I think just no matter how disciplined you are, if your writing tool is attached to this perpetual fun machine, there's just no way to get writing done. And so at least, even if you're really disciplined, your brain is going to get tired resisting the perpetual fun machine. So that, or some method like that. I mean, I know writers who use a computer with no connectivity whatsoever, especially fiction writers will just, basically turn their laptop into what is basically a typewriter. In my case, I do need a little bit of access to the web because I need to look things up as I go along usually. So that's extremely useful for any modern writer, I think. And then I think just I have benefited from growing up in my career thinking of what I do as a craft rather than an art. And even though as I was just saying, I really enjoy the art of it, and I love that my part of the business allows me to explore that art. I do think of it as a craft, mostly as a craft, and I think that helps me get through the kind of typical writer's drama where you're like, oh God, I have writer's block. I need to go, drink my mint julep on the daybed and recline. It's just more like I'm a nurse or I'm a carpenter or, I have a deadline and I have to do this. And I think thinking of it as a craft and thinking of it as a series of steps that are not always predictable, but they are there, and that you can always put your fingers to the keyboard, even if what you're writing is not very good. You can put your fingers to the keyboard and do it and go back and make it better later when you are in, a better mental space, so to speak. So those are two things. Can I think of a third thing? I don't know. It's, so much of what I've learned about how I do and why I do it has to do with the kind of story I'm writing. But as a freelancer, those two things I think speak to self-discipline. And as a freelancer, that's something I have to think about all the time because no one's watching me. I could be here just surfing on the, just shopping all day and no one would care. So I've had to learn to discipline myself or find tools or tricks of mine that help me do that. And I would say that for any writer, writing should, maybe this is my third tip, that writing should be something you enjoy. I really don't understand people who say they hate writing, who are writers. I'm like, why do it? But I think it's hard, even no matter how experienced you are, it's really hard to get started writing. To start a writing project because we are constantly distracted by more finite things. Writing any project is this sort of task. You don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know if you're moving forward or if you're going to have to, backtrack. It's not a linear process. Like it's much easier to go do the dishes because you know how long that's going to take, and you're going to just work your way through it and get done. Writing is hard to get started, but once you start it, I think all my disciplinary tactics are just ways to convince myself to get started, because once I get started, I really, really like it. And I love the process of translation, and I love the process of playing with words and trying to find the right word and all of those things.
Thank you. Sarah?
Well, I have a question that I think is going to come up in our class very soon and probably has already come up for some of our students, and it's the idea of accuracy, and particularly science writing. I think maybe this goes back to Kirby's earlier question, what's different? I think it is complex, and it's more complex than entertainment or politics even. So when accuracy is an issue, how do you address it? Do you let your sources review? When do you let them? How does that work for you?
Yeah, thanks for asking those questions, because those are really those are big issues in what we do, and you're right, that is different from entertainment or politics. So the issue of accuracy, I fairly often talk to groups of scientists about media, and I work with an organization called Compass, whose job is to act as an interface between science and the media, and they will often bring in journalists to their training, not to so much train the scientists directly, but to say, here's how my world works, here's what I want or need from scientists when I'm telling a story about science, and here's how you can present your information in a way that's going to make my job easier and that's going to further our common aim of, making sense of this for the public. So through that, I often try and stress the difference between precision and accuracy, and that scientists often confused, in my mind at least. I think they're confused, but they think I'm confused, I'm sure. But they often will think that precision and accuracy are the same thing. That if you don't include things to the maximum precision known, if you don't include all the caveats with all the details, that it's somehow inaccurate. And I think it's my job to say, look, a story can still be accurate even if I, in the interest of having my busy readers read the thing all the way through, if I have left out some of that precision. And that's, of course, a judgment call, and I've certainly, battled with scientists who have thought that I took out too much precision, or that's something that's really in the eye of the beholder. But I do think that that is a big part of my process of translation. Actually, is figuring out what kinds of precision are crucial to the accuracy of the story, and which kinds can be left out in the interest of finding a larger audience. And then what was the second part of your question? It was really important. Oh, seeing drafts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, big issue. So for those of you who aren't in science, there is this tradition of peer review where scientists, routinely send around drafts of their public, their articles, either for anonymous peer review or for peer review by their friends and colleagues for feedback. And and so they, understandably expect the same from journalists when their work is being written about. They're like, well, so when can I see a draft of this, so that I can correct any errors? And this leads to, like a lot of awkward conversations between journalists and scientists, because there's this cultural divide. Because as journalists, we are coming from a tradition where, we may not be reporting on politics, but our colleagues are. And, I always say, well, imagine if Woodward and Bernstein had shown Richard Nixon drafts of their stories for the Washington Post about Watergate, like that. You just don't do that because your sources have a vested interest and you're not exposing the information that you're about to expose. So our situation is different, but we come from that tradition. And, there's politics in science, and there's money in science, and there, there are things that, sometimes that we write about that scientists may not want us to be writing about. So we do have to maintain that level of distance between sources, our sources as we call them, and our own work. We can't give them editing power over our own work. That said, I think that we do have more. We share more goals with our sources than straight out political reporters do. We're not always working. We're not always in an adversarial position, and sometimes our interests overlap, especially in accuracy. So I will not check quotes with sources. I just don't. I just make I either record or I take very good notes, and I make sure my quotes are accurate, because if you run a quote by a source, they will change it. They'll change it and make it sound like nothing no normal human would ever say. Or they'll make it really boring, and like the reason you're quoting them is that they put it in an interesting way. So I just don't, because it's not good for the story. But I will fairly often run a paragraph by a source. If I don't check things about other people's work with them, but if there's like a 3 sentences where I'm summarizing the results of a study, I sometimes will either call them and walk through it with them, or say, hey, is this an accurate way of representing your work? And I'll say, please let me know if there are any factual errors. And sometimes they'll write back and say, no, that's great. Or sometimes they'll write me back with like a page of explanation that I'm like, no, that's all the stuff I took out. But it gives, and they, they know, and I know that I can't always, I can't just take their corrections and incorporate them. I have to my first priority is with my audience, but it does give me a chance to say, okay, here's their version of the most accurate version in their mind of the story, and is there anything that's left out of my version that really that I really need to add back in, or is there just a simple misunderstanding that I need to correct, and I can do that before publication. Does that help?
That helps tremendously with some conversations I've been having in the last week or so.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, it's such a tricky issue.
In this class, and also in a panel event that we're having. So yes, that's tremendously helpful. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I think that the key is that we need to maintain that separation between ourselves and our sources. But there are times when we can work together as science journalists. It doesn't have to be, and shouldn't, and for the most part, shouldn't be adversarial. But we need to maintain that freedom to do investigatory work when we need to.
There's tremendous interest in this class, particularly that we're seeing from our medical campus, and they're asking these kinds of questions of and they want a forum in which they can discuss it. But I'd say overwhelmingly, they want to be partners in this process. They recognize that science communication is not where it should be, and they're telling me they take the blame for some of that.
Yeah.
Embrace all of the solutions that you've suggested. But I do think that they understand that they have a role in this, and that some compromise and working together is inevitable and necessary.
Yeah, there's a good book. The organization I work for occasionally, Compass, that does this work with scientists and media training. The director of it has written a book called "Escape from the Ivory Tower."
I'm reading.
Oh, are you? Okay. So that's my friend Nancy Barron's book, and that's, I think, really helpful. It speaks to a lot of these issues that come up for, academics especially, but I imagine also medical professionals. And I'm always careful when I do those kinds of talks and trainings. I don't think researchers need to become media professionals. That's our job. We don't need them to be doing our job for us, and I've worked for a long time to do this job, and I know it's really time consuming, so I don't want them to think that they have to take on a second career. They want to be focused on the research, and they should be, but I do think that there are things that they can do that are actually fun and helpful to them in their own work as they're talking to people in other specialties and so forth, where they can learn to talk about their work. They can learn to tell a story about their work rather than getting buried in the details, that sort of thing, that they can just practice almost for fun, and it can take them a long way.
So maybe one more question, Valerie. Do you have any? Well, that's okay.
I was just going to ask, kind of following up on what you just said about working with the scientists and your sources. Have you ever felt like when you're kind of not battling it out with them, but if they come to you with something they think should sort of be correct or put it a different way, and you stand your ground, and you're like, no, I think I need to keep it this way. Have you ever felt like you were going to burn any bridges, so to speak, or were you not as concerned about that, or maybe as a freelancer, were you more concerned as opposed to if you work for a specific paper or something?
I think I've been lucky in that I can't think of any case where it was really like a core issue that they were upset about. It was always details.
Gotcha. So maybe not a huge concern.
Yeah, it was always a case where I was able to just say, sorry, like I see where you're coming from, but I have to think about my audience, and here's what I decided, or here's what my editor and I decided. Sometimes it's not up to me. Like sometimes I'm in the situation where I'm kind of battling for more specificity, and my editor's like, oh please, like no, you're too, because writers, after spending a lot of time on a story, writers do get too deep into it, and kind of, we lose track of what's interesting and what our audience needs to know, and editors are there as a backstop to be like, no, you don't need that extra paragraph about whatever, and so I can sometimes say, look, it was my decision, or I just had to make this decision, and they might be irritated with me, but they're not, it's not like the relationship's over. Actually, the most amount of flack I've gotten from scientists is when I portray them telling jokes. They hate that. They don't always hate it, but sometimes I'm always like surprised at their consternation when I report them telling a joke, and I'm like, that makes you sound like an interesting person, and I mean, I try to use humor a lot in my stories when I can, because my readers are science phobic to some extent, like I have been at certain points in my life, and I think portraying scientists as human is really important. And I will tell, I have told this to scientists who have been like, oh God, I can't believe you reported me telling that off-color joke, and I'm like, look, that really take one for the team, because that just humanized you for 4 million readers of National Geographic. And I think the problem is that they, if we as journalists are conscious of our editors sitting on our shoulder, or our peers sitting on our shoulder, and assessing what we write, scientists are very conscious of their own peers, assess. They're not thinking of the general reader. They're thinking of the reaction of their peers, and their peers are going to be like, "Oh, you really didn't look very serious in that story. You know, you look like kind of a joker." And they're embarrassed about that. They're embarrassed about what their peers are going to say. But I've managed to bring a couple people around to the idea that it's okay to be funny in public.
Great. Well, I think that's going to be a wrap. So thank you so much. This is
Oh, thanks a lot.
And yeah, thanks for spending, gosh, more than an hour with us, sharing tips on writing and your career, and it was wonderful. So thanks again, Michelle.
My pleasure.
We'll end our broadcast. So
Okay.
have a great.
Good luck to all of you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Take care. All right. Interesting.
Okay, should I just hang up here? Thanks, Jeff.